Fritz the Cat, the first animated film to ever get an X rating in the US, which it very well deserved. It has it all: violence, sex, drugs, curse words, racism, police brutality, prostitutes, domestic abuse, and much more. Quite the change of pace compared to the typical Saturday morning cartoon from that time. Released in 1972, Fritz the Cat had mixed reviews from both critics and audiences alike. Some saw it as insightful, and that it was an accurate look into the turbulent socio-political landscape that was taking place around that time. Others saw it as incredibly inappropriate, and that it was an affront to the wholesome world of animation. Needless to say, Fritz the Cat definitely rocked the boat and stood out to people in one way or another. It's one of the most interesting animated films that come out during the 1970s, and it was truly an icebreaker. There is no question that it made an impact on the animation industry, and I think that makes it worth talking about. There's a lot more to this film than just dirty jokes and booty. Why are there tails coming out of their butts? How does that logistically work? You know what? Whatever. Never mind.
Who do you think I am, Geraldine?
The story for the production of Fritz the Cat is one of the most interesting stories I've ever heard from the animation industry. Strap in. Animation, for a good chunk of its history, has been aimed towards children. The first animated movie, Snow White, was precisely that way, and Disney has continued that trend with their other films up to this very day, with many other studios who have copied their format. Fleischer, Terrytoons, Hanna-Barbera. It was very clear that animation had been pushed into a direction that was mostly seen as child-friendly and innocent. Now, things started to change around the 1960s and 70s, since American culture was shifting and people were expressing themselves more. This was right around the time of the hippie movement, so that most likely has something to do with it. You know, being open-minded and free love. But before Fritz was an animated film, it was a comic strip and was created by Robert Crumb. Its first appearance was in the magazine Help in 1965. Crumb was really into the underground comic scene, as well as the counterculture community that was going on around the 1960s. The guy also took psychedelic drugs to help open his mind and craft his creations, with Fritz the Cat being the most popular. The stories were, unsurprisingly, about Fritz the Cat, an anthropomorphic character who got in over his head. He likes drugs, he likes sex, and he very much so likes himself. Yeah, as you can see, the source material was just as dirty as the movie itself, if not more so. In 1968, Crumb self-published the first issue of Zap Comic, which made him a success in the underground comic world. And this caught the attention of a certain animator, Ralph Bakshi. Ralph is truly one of the most fascinating people from the world of animation. This is the same guy who directed the animated Lord of the Rings movie. But I'll talk about that in detail in a future video.
Look.
Ralph got his start back in the day at Terrytoons and worked his way up through the ranks and eventually became a director there. In 1967, he was hired by Paramount to run their animation department, but they closed up shop soon after. Ralph then formed his own studio in 1969 called Bakshi Productions and did commercials for Coke and other minor stuff. But Ralph was yearning to try something different and personal. And that's where Fritz the Cat comes in. Ralph stumbled across Crumb's creation while at a bookstore, and it grabbed his attention. Ralph then reached out to Crumb and pitched him drawings in Crumb's style to prove to him that a faithful movie of Fritz could be done. Crumb was actually intrigued and even lent Ralph one of his sketchbooks for references. So far, so good, right? All right, folks, you ready for a roller coaster of drama? I can't stress enough how wild this stuff gets. It is hilarious. Here we go. So Crumb was into the idea at first, but started to become more reluctant to the movie. Ralph is on the record saying that Crumb is, quote, one of the slickest hustlers you'll see in your whole life. See, told you, it gets worse. Bakshi producer Steve Krantz sent Ralph to San Francisco to get the paperwork signed by Crumb so they could have the rights to the film. Bakshi even stayed with him for a week, but Crumb would keep giving him the runaround. But something happened. Crumb had to leave town for a trip, And get this, Ralph got Crumb's wife, who had the power of attorney, to sign the paperwork. Holy shit. Talk about going behind someone's back. But there was no time to worry about that. Bakshi had to go find a studio to fund the project, to which, according to him, every studio in the area turned him down. The only one who was willing to finance and distribute it was Warner Brothers, which wasn't going to last. All right, this is my favorite part of the story. So Ralph and Kranz showcased some of their work to Warner, to which the suits from Warner were absolutely shocked. According to Ralph, quote, "You should have seen their faces in the screening room when I first screened a bit of Fritz. I'll remember their faces until I die. One of them left the room. Holy hell, you should have seen his face." End quote. The suits from Warner told Ralph and Kranz to cut back on the sexual stuff and to cast big names as the voice actors. Ralph outright refused, and they lost their funding from Warner.
How long was I in there?
About 5 minutes.
Why are we funding this?
Fortunately for Ralph, they were able to secure funding through Jerry Gross of Cinemation Industries. Turns out that Jerry was a grindhouse producer, so he wasn't timid of Fritz since he was so used to trashy movies anyway. Finally, Bakshi Productions had their funding and they could make their movie. Bakshi had to move from New York City to LA for the production. Since this project was inherently different, it got a lot of attention from animators in the area. Some of them saw this project as freeing and a chance to try something different. Others hated Fritz the Cat and thought that it was an insult to the animation industry. Heck, some of these people even placed an ad in the Hollywood Reporter saying that they didn't want this smut in their town. One animator even quit because he didn't want a black crow shooting a pig cop. Spoilers, that happens. A female animator quit because she didn't want to draw bare breast. Spoilers, that happens in the movie too. Despite how difficult it was to get the film off the ground and the resistance it faced, Ralph had faith that Fritz the Cat could succeed. Things were already starting to change around that time due to the success of the Beatles' Yellow Submarine in 1968. Ralph saw Yellow Submarine as proof that animation could be appealing to an older audience, and that they will show up to support it. In 1972, Fritz the Cat made its theatrical debut, and to the surprise of many, it was a massive success. It would go on to become the highest-grossing independent animated feature of all time, and made over $90 million. Now, it cost around $700,000 to make, so that was a huge return on investment. Rolling Stone said that it was one of the most important animation breakthroughs since Yellow Submarine. When you look back on it, it is truly impressive that Fritz the Cat was as successful as it was, since it couldn't really advertise due to its X rating. But I actually think that's what ended up being its salvation. The fact that it was the first X-rated animated film in the US made it highly appealing to adult viewers. Oh, time for some more drama. So it turns out that Crumb hated the film, despite making a lot of money from it. He despised it so much that he actually killed Fritz off in the comic because he objected to what happened to Fritz in the film. That right there is some deep hatred. He even satirized Ralph and Kranz in the comic too. Hell, he even sued to have his name taken off the film. Yeah, he hated the movie that much.
We'll see who gets lost without whom.
All right, let's talk about the story. Unsurprisingly, we follow our main character, Fritz. He's a college student with a thirst for life and all of the vices it has to offer. Sex, drugs, feeding his ego. The guy thinks he's some kind of wise and profound philosopher who understands the big picture of life. But in reality, he's just a prideful jerk who wants to screw and get high. The way the film's set up feels more like 3 separate episodes that were combined into one movie. Instead of having a single story that flows from one act to the other, we instead see Fritz get involved in 3 standalone misadventures. One where he tries to get laid with 3 girls and then runs from the cops, one where he gets involved with the crows and tries to rally them against the police, and then one where he gets caught up with a bunch of Nazi terrorists who want to bring down the system. Yeah, this movie is all over the place. The setting this film takes place in is a world of anthropomorphic creatures. But the movie gets real serious with it. The police and the state are portrayed as pigs. Black people are shown as crows. And then you got some neo-Nazis that range from a heroin addict biker to a gross lizard lady. It is very obvious that this movie had a thing or two to say when it came to social commentary, and the folks who made this film wanted to get that point across with its character designs. There is no doubt that Fritz the Cat is a period piece. It weighs in on the political and cultural climate of the late 1960s and early 70s. Racism, hippies, free love, police brutality, the control of the state, fighting the man, and drugs. Lots and lots of drugs. Each segment of this film prominently features drugs in one way or another. But when you put the symbolism and social commentary to the side and see the story for what it is, it's not that good. Fritz isn't that fun of a character to follow. Like, I get it. He's an ass, and he's supposed to be unpleasant, but it just wasn't that fun or interesting to me. Always Sunny in Philadelphia is a good example of a show with main characters who are a bunch of undesirable degenerates, but the show is still able to have fun with that. You're supposed to embrace how much of an ass they can be, but still having fun with them. But for Fritz, he's just a pretentious, snarky jerk. Maybe the movie didn't want the audience to like him, and that was the point. But it made it hard for me to care about him and the trouble he got himself into. I wasn't rooting for him to succeed, nor did I really care to see what was coming to him. He wasn't fun, and that's a problem. Also, the side characters weren't that fun either. Most of them were only there for the social commentary aspect of the film, and that was about it. Very few of them were interesting when it came to being their own individual character. There were also these moments in the movie when background characters would talk to each other and carry on conversations that sound like they're straight from real life. Actually, I'm pretty sure that's the case. That Ralph and his team went out into the world and got permission to record these people talking to each other about random topics. And then they would take those recordings and then animate them. These sequences in the movie are fascinating, but they feel a bit out of place and are very hard to follow at times. Having these conversations were incredibly hard to understand. Still, I think it's pretty cool that they tried something different. But overall, the story for Fritz the Cat is more interesting to me for its social commentary, but not so much for the quality of its characters and stories. Like, it's fascinating for having an X rating, for talking about sex and drugs and racism, and how it went about symbolizing characters, and the parallels it shared to real life around that time. But when it comes down to the actual quality of the stories and characters, I just didn't care for it. Just too many unpleasant characters combined with jarring stories that were all over the place.
Far out.
As far as the animation in the movie goes, it's pretty damn good. I like how it looks rough and gritty. It fits well with the stories and the setting of the film. Like I said before, we have anthro characters, and most of them are designed in a way to represent something. The pig cops are a very obvious example of that. Also, this one pig is Jewish. That irony. I'll tell you this though, I do not like the tails on the girl characters. They're coming out of their butts. Put it over their butts. That makes much more sense and looks much better. The actual animation itself and how it flows looks great to me. And there were even some scenes that were quite trippy. Fritz takes some drugs and shoots fire out of his mouth. And then there's this other scene where this crow comes out and starts snapping his fingers, and he changes colors while we slowly zoom in onto the next shot for the movie. Kind of random, but I like that. This movie is already experimental, so I'm glad to see them take advantage of that from a visual approach. Overall, this movie embraced its source material and had fun with it. Visually, it's very different, and I'm glad that it was able to succeed in that regard.
You spend years and years with your nose buried in these goddamn tomes, while the world is passing you by.
In conclusion, Fritz the Cat was a groundbreaking film. It was the first X-rated animated movie in the US, and it financially succeeded in a market that many saw as just for kids. Animation had a reputation at that time that was stuck on families and kids' entertainment. But Ralph and his team wanted to do more than that, to show that there was a demand for mature animated content, and that it could financially succeed too. I also respect that it used its X rating to actually say something, to discuss controversial topics of substance, whether a person agrees with them or not. It could have been so easy for them just to focus on sex and use foul language, but it was a lot more than that. The production and completion of this movie had a long and bizarre road, but Ralph and his team proved that animation could be more than just for kids, that adults too could enjoy it. Yeah, I admit that the movie itself isn't that great on its own merit, but it definitely mixed things up and serves as an interesting case study for the history of animation. So the next time you're watching South Park or Rick and Morty or BoJack, just remember what Fritz the Cat did for the animation industry and how it broke the ice for people to enjoy adult animated content. Oh, and there was a sequel. And it sucked a lot. We'll talk about that later.